On a stormy evening in downtown Chicago, rain lashed against the streets, turning them into glistening rivers of asphalt. The city's iconic skyline shimmered through the haze, while commuters rushed beneath a canopy of umbrellas. Raindrops splattered against Ethan Cole's sleek black sedan, each one exploding like a tiny firework on the windshield. But Ethan hardly noticed the deluge. As the CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the Midwest, his mind was consumed by the details of an upcoming pitch that could revolutionize his company's future. Time was his most precious commodity, and every second of his meticulously planned day was accounted for. Ethan prided himself on his precision, a life lived by the clock. Emotions to him were indulgences to be savored in private, far from the boardroom's sharp edges. Yet, as he waited for a light to turn green at an intersection, something outside the ordinary pierced his well-ordered rhythm. On the far corner, framed against the rain-drenched backdrop of the city, stood a figure that didn't belong to the landscape of suits and briefcases. A young woman, barely more than a girl, cradled a baby in her arms as she hunched against the onslaught of rain. Her tattered coat clung to her like a second skin, soaked through and offering little protection. Her trembling arms enfolded the tiny bundle with desperate tenderness, as though her very willpower was the only thing keeping the child warm. Ethan's gaze lingered, captured by the scene. He noticed the woman clutching a piece of cardboard, its scribbled message blurred by the downpour, "Please help. We need food and shelter." Something about her posture, a mix of exhaustion and fierce determination, stirred a memory he thought he'd buried long ago. For a fleeting moment, he was a boy again, huddled under the same unforgiving rain, before success had swept him into a world far removed from hardship. The light turned green, and the impatient blare of horns jolted Ethan back to the present. He glanced in his rearview mirror, preparing to drive on. But before his foot pressed the gas, an uncharacteristic surge of empathy gripped him. Without thinking, he lowered his window. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting through the rain. The young woman hesitated, clearly wary. She pulled the child closer, her eyes wide and uncertain. For a moment Ethan thought she might run. But when their gazes met, the plea in her eyes was unmistakable. "Get in," Ethan said, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman froze, glancing at the baby in her arms as if seeking reassurance. Finally, driven by the primal need to shield her child, she stepped forward and climbed into the warm car. Ethan adjusted the heater, casting quick glances at her through the rearview mirror. Her thin frame shook from the cold, and her soaked hair clung to her pale face. Despite the hardship etched into her features, there was a quiet dignity about her. A soft resilience that spoke louder than words. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, his tone softening. "Claire," she answered faintly. She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms and added with a small, protective smile, "And this is Mia." Ethan nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Without a second thought, he turned the car away from the airport and toward his lakefront home, a place filled with luxury but devoid of warmth. Something about Claire and her baby stirred emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole let his heart take the lead. Through the rearview mirror, Ethan's eyes flickered back to the drenched woman and her baby. The rain had turned her already thin coat into a useless second skin, barely shielding the child she cradled so desperately. Her trembling arms wrapped tightly around the small bundle, as if her sheer wool was the only thing keeping the cold at bay. Her every movement screamed tenderness and urgency, an unrelenting battle to protect the fragile life in her arms. Ethan felt a strange and unwelcome stir in his chest, a tugging sensation that he hadn't felt in years. It was unsettling, like a faint echo of emotions he'd worked hard to silence in the relentless march of building his success. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, attempting to focus on the task at hand. He had a schedule to keep, a world-changing presentation awaiting him, and no room for distraction. Still, as the traffic light remained stubbornly red, his gaze was drawn back to her. Even from this distance, her face was etched with exhaustion, hollowed eyes and a pale complexion betrayed the toll life had taken. Yet there was something else in her expression, a fire that hadn't been extinguished. Determination. She held a small, soggy piece of cardboard close to her chest, it scrawled "Please" still legible, "Please help. We need food and shelter." For a fleeting moment Ethan's mind was pulled back to his own childhood. He could almost feel the biting chill of cold streets and hear the echo of growling stomachs. Before his name had meant anything to anyone, he'd known hunger and desperation, the kind that left invisible scars. He shook the thought away almost as quickly as it came, forcing himself to focus on the green light that was seconds from releasing him back into the flow of traffic. But just as his car began to inch forward, the pull became irresistible. He had learned long ago how to compartmentalize, how to silence empathy when it threatened to complicate his goals. But in this moment, it refused to be ignored. His chest tightened with a wave of emotion he couldn't quite explain. With a sharp intake of breath, Ethan lowered his window. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting through the relentless drum of the rain. The woman froze, instinctively clutching the baby closer as she turned her wary eyes toward him. Ethan hesitated for a heartbeat, feeling the weight of a decision that could shatter his carefully structured day. Then, surprising even himself, he gestured for her to come closer. "Get in," he said, his tone more commanding than he intended. For a moment she seemed paralyzed by suspicion, her eyes darting between him and the baby. But the storm showed no mercy, and her child let out a soft whimper that broke through her hesitation. Slowly she stepped forward and slid into the back seat, the baby held tightly against her chest. As Ethan adjusted the heater, the warmth began to fill the space. He glanced at her through the mirror, noticing the way her body shivered despite her efforts to appear composed. Her expression was a mix of gratitude and guardedness, as if she were bracing for this act of kindness to come with a cost. Ethan didn't know why he'd stopped or why this moment felt like more than a fleeting impulse. All he knew was that something about her had reached into a part of him he thought had long since been buried. Ethan hesitated as the rain drummed relentlessly on the car roof, drowning out the bustling noise of Chicago streets. His hand hovered over the window control for a moment longer than he cared to admit, his breath caught somewhere between doubt and instinct. Finally, with a sharp intake of breath, he lowered the window. "Hey," he called, his voice barely audible over the storm. The young woman startled, her wary eyes darting toward him. She clutched the baby closer, as if shielding the little one from a potential threat. Ethan noticed how her arms, thin and trembling, struggled to hold the child securely. The rain had soaked through her tattered coat, and her face was streaked with what might have been tears, blending seamlessly with the water cascading down her cheeks. "Get in," he said firmly, the words leaving his lips before he fully processed them. For a moment she froze, caught in a silent battle of fear and necessity. Her suspicion was palpable, but the baby stirred, letting out a faint cry that seemed to push her decision. Slowly she stepped forward, clutching the child tightly as if bracing for rejection. Ethan leaned over and opened the passenger door, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. She slid into the back seat, her movements cautious and deliberate. Water dripped from her coat onto the leather upholstery, but Ethan didn't flinch. Instead he adjusted the car heater, cranking it high. Warm air filled the space, pushing back the chill of the storm. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, their eyes met briefly. Hers were tired, no exhausted, but there was something else too, a quiet strength. A kind of dignity that seemed to refuse pity, even in the face of desperation. She adjusted the baby in her arms, her movements tender and protective, and Ethan found himself momentarily lost in the scene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost swallowed by the hum of the heater. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his mind grappling with why he'd done what he just did. A part of him wanted to call it a random act of kindness, but deep down it didn't feel random at all. Something about her had pulled at a place inside him he thought had long since closed off. Instead of heading toward the airport, Ethan made a sudden decision. He turned the car toward his lakeshore drive home, a sprawling modern mansion that, despite its grandeur, rarely felt lived in. It was a space of order, not warmth. A fortress built to shield him from vulnerability. But now, as the windshield wipers swished back and forth against the downpour, he realized this choice, this woman and her child, was unraveling that carefully constructed shield. The woman's thin frame trembled, despite her attempts to appear composed. Her gaze flitted around the car, cautious but not panicked. Ethan glanced at her again in the mirror, his heart catching at the sight of her pale face and soaked hair. She was worn down by life, yes, but there was no mistaking her pride, the way she held herself just so, as if to remind the world that she hadn't given up. "What's your name?" he asked finally, softening his voice. "Maria," she replied, cradling the baby closer. "And this is Emma." Ethan nodded, saying nothing more. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt as though he'd stumbled into a story far bigger than himself. Ethan cleared his throat, glancing briefly into the rearview mirror. The silence between them was heavy, though not oppressive. He softened his tone, careful not to startle her. "What's your name?" The young woman hesitated before replying faintly, "Maria." She looked down at the baby nestled in her arms, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "And this is Emma?" Ethan nodded, saying nothing more. The warmth of the car heater filled the space, its hum a quiet contrast to the storm outside. Despite the strangeness of the situation, there was a fragile comfort in the silence. For Maria, it felt surreal, a moment of safety and warmth that had been absent from her life for too long. She glanced at her daughter's peaceful face, her heart heavy with gratitude yet cautious about what would come next. For Ethan, the moment stirred something uncomfortably familiar. Maria's protective gaze, her fragile yet unyielding strength, touched a part of him he usually kept buried. Memories of his own struggles, of cold nights and a hunger that gnawed not only at the body but at the soul, flickered in his mind. He pushed them aside, unwilling to dwell on the past. This wasn't about him. He refocused on the decision he'd just made, a choice that even he couldn't fully explain. The sleek car eventually pulled up to a gated estate, and Ethan pressed a button to open the gates. Maria stared in silent disbelief as the house came into view. It was a sprawling modern mansion, its glass walls gleaming under the faint glow of the garden lights. The well-manicured lawn stretched out like a dream, untouched by the storm raging beyond its borders. Maria clutched Emma tighter, unsure of what to say. This place, this palace, was so far removed from her reality that it felt almost like stepping into a storybook. She remained silent as Ethan parked the car and stepped out. Her eyes followed him as he walked around to her side, opening the back door. "You can stay here until I get back," Ethan said, his voice steady but gentle. He extended a silver key, the cool metal catching the dim light. Maria stared at the key in his hand, her fingers trembling as she reached out to take it. She clutched it tightly, her mind racing. A key, a literal key, to a place like this. It felt impossible, like some cosmic mistake had landed her here. She started, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan waved her off, his gaze distant, as though he were trying to downplay the weight of his decision. "No need to thank me. Just take care of her. And yourself." He turned back toward the car without waiting for her response. Maria watched him go, her heart pounding. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to question why someone like him would extend such generosity. But then she looked down at Emma, her tiny face peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. Whatever this moment was, it was a gift she couldn't afford to refuse. With her daughter nestled close and the silver key clutched in her trembling hand, Maria stepped into the mansion, not knowing what the next day would bring. But for the first time in months she felt a spark of hope. Maria's hands trembled as she clutched the key, the cool metal pressing into her palm like an anchor in a sea of disbelief. She stood motionless for a moment, staring at it as if expecting it to vanish, to prove this was all some cruel mirage. People like her, struggling mothers on the brink of hopelessness, didn't receive acts of compassion like this, especially from men like Ethan Cole. His polished demeanor, his air of quiet authority, suggested someone far removed from the raw struggles of survival. I don't know how to thank you," Maria murmured, her voice shaky with exhaustion and a tide of emotions she could barely contain. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of relief and the overwhelming weight of being truly seen for the first time in what felt like forever. Ethan avoided her gaze, shifting slightly on his feet. "No need to thank me," he said gruffly, his tone distant but not unkind. Displays of vulnerability, even from others, made him uneasy. "Just take care of her. And yourself." He turned quickly, heading back toward his car without waiting for a response. The rain still poured down in sheets, drumming against the pavement as Ethan opened the driver's side door. Maria watched him, the weight of the key still in her trembling grip, her heart pounding with emotions too tangled to unravel. Ethan didn't look back as he climbed into the car and pulled away. He told himself it was because he had a plane to catch, a meeting that could decide the future of his company. Yet, as the lights of his mansion disappeared in the rearview mirror, an unsettling feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't like him to do things like this. He wasn't cold-hearted, but years of success and strategy had trained him to keep a safe distance from anything that could complicate his orderly world. Compassion, he'd learned, was best given in measured doses, donations, sponsorships, partnerships. Not in impulsive decisions that landed a stranger and her child under his roof. And yet, there was something about Maria. Something in the way her voice had wavered but never broken, in the way she held her daughter with a fierce, almost defiant tenderness. It stirred memories he didn't care to revisit, memories of cold nights and silent prayers for a second chance. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers did little to calm the turmoil in his mind. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, But he knew Maria wasn't just another struggling soul he had helped on a whim. Her presence, even in those fleeting moments, had touched a part of him he hadn't realized was still vulnerable. As he merged onto the highway toward the airport, Ethan's thoughts remained fixed on the image of Maria standing in the rain, clutching her baby and that silver key as if it held the promise of a better life. He didn't know why he'd done it, why he'd given her his house, his trust. But one thing was certain: this wasn't the last time he'd think of her. Not by a long shot. Maria stepped into the mansion, her movements slow and cautious as though she feared the warmth and grandeur around her might disappear if she disturbed it. The soft glow of the interior lights reflected off polished marble floors, and the faint fragrance of fresh flowers lingered in the air. It was a world she had never known, a distant, almost mythical reality. She held Emma close, her arms tightening protectively around the small child as she took hesitant steps forward. The spacious living room stretched out before her, filled with elegant furniture, abstract art adorning the walls, and a crystal chandelier that sparkled like a constellation suspended in the air. It was too much to take in, too overwhelming. To Maria, it felt like a mirage, an impossible refuge that could vanish at any moment. The rain still lashed against the windows, a stark reminder of the storm outside. Yet here within these walls the world seemed to pause. Maria inhaled deeply, the warmth of the house seeping into her cold skin and quieting the relentless tension she carried. It was a haven she hadn't dared to dream of. She wandered through the house, her footsteps muffled by plush rugs as she explored in silence. Every corner revealed a new marvel, a place so pristine and opulent that it felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Maria's gaze fell on Emma, who stirred slightly in her arms, her tiny face framed by the dim light. For a fleeting moment, Maria allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in months, a glimmer of peace. Eventually she found a room tucked away on the second floor. It was a vision of comfort, with a soft bed adorned with fresh linens and pillows that seemed to invite rest. Gently, Maria laid Emma down, smoothing the blankets around her small frame. The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, taking in the luxurious room, and a sparkle of curiosity lit up her face. Maria couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with emotion. For months she had fought to shield Emma from the worst of their struggles. Tonight, for the first time, she felt like she had succeeded. Even if just for a night, her daughter was safe, warm, and protected. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling as rain splattered against the windows. But within the quiet embrace of the mansion, Maria felt a fragile sense of calm. She sank into a nearby armchair, her body heavy with exhaustion but her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Looking around, she let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. This house, this impossible shelter, felt like a lifeline dropped from the heavens. She didn't know what the future held or how long this moment would last, but for now she allowed herself to rest. Maria's eyes lingered on Emma, whose peaceful breathing seemed to harmonize with the warmth of the room. The child's tiny hand twitched in her sleep, and Maria's smile softened. Whatever challenges lay ahead, tonight was theirs, a stolen reprieve, a miracle she would carry with her no matter what came next. Maria closed the door softly behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing like a seal on the storm outside. For a moment she stood still, letting the quiet embrace of the house wash over her. The air felt different here, calmer, lighter, as if years of torment and uncertainty had been left outside the pristine walls. Her shoulders, perpetually tense from fear and exhaustion, began to relax for the first time in what felt like forever. She let her gaze wander around the room. The tall windows framed a dark, rain-lit garden, droplets racing down the glass in silvery streaks. Elegant furniture filled the space, every piece exuding an effortless luxury that seemed more suited to the pages of a magazine than real life. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream she was afraid to wake from. In her arms, Emma stirred faintly but did not wake. Maria looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, her small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. For the first time in so long, Maria felt a pang of relief. Emma was safe, truly safe, and the knowledge brought a lump to her throat. This house, improbable as it was, had become their sanctuary for the night. And that alone was a miracle. Maria gently cradled her daughter closer, pressing a soft kiss to Emma's damp hair. The thought of having one night without worry, without the constant fear of being cold, hungry, or vulnerable, felt like a luxury beyond imagining. For someone like her, someone who had lived without a permanent address or a sense of security for so long, this moment was more than she could have ever hoped for. As her eyes roamed the space, Maria noticed an open kitchen at the far end of the room. Its gleaming appliances sparkled under the soft light, their polished surfaces reflecting a life she hadn't touched in years. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of the hunger that had been her constant companion. For a moment she hesitated. The kitchen, pristine and untouched, felt almost forbidden, like stepping into it might break the fragile magic of the evening. But hunger, persistent and gnawing, overpowered her reservations. Carefully she laid Emma down on a nearby sofa, tucking a soft blanket around her small body. Her daughter didn't stir, blissfully unaware of the struggle that had consumed their days and nights. Maria stepped into the kitchen, her movements tentative at first, as though afraid of being discovered. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal handles of the cabinets, opening one to reveal shelves stocked with food, fresh ingredients she hadn't seen in months. She inhaled sharply, her throat tightening at the sight. Eggs, bread, fruits, vegetables, simple things that felt like treasures. Without thinking too much, Maria reached for what she needed. Eggs, a few vegetables and a loaf of fresh bread. Her hands moved almost on instinct, the motions of cooking stirring a warmth in her chest. It had been so long since she'd had access to ingredients like these, so long since she'd been able to prepare a meal without fear of where the next one would come from. As she stirred the eggs in a skillet, the faint aroma began to fill the air, wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. Maria allowed herself a small, quiet smile. For most people this would be an ordinary moment, a mundane task. But for her it was everything. It was control, security, and a glimpse of a life she hadn't dared to hope for. Tonight at least they had a roof, a meal and peace. And for Maria that was more than enough. Maria moved quietly, her bare feet patting softly against the polished floor as she carried Emma to the nearest sofa. Her daughter's small body was limp with the deep, untroubled sleep of a child who finally felt safe. Maria tucked a blanket around her, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead before stepping back. She stood there for a moment, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, a rare serenity washing over her. Turning toward the kitchen, Maria hesitated. It felt like stepping into a space that didn't belong to her, a gleaming sanctuary of abundance and order. But the quiet hum of hunger in her stomach urged her forward. She approached the cabinets and opened one tentatively, as if afraid the magic might dissipate. Her fingers trembled
Inside,
as she reached
found
for the
shelves
refrigerator.
brimming with food.
When she
Cans,
pulled it open,
jars,
the
and
lightly
neatly
arranged
spilled out,
packages,
illuminating
a
a
treasure
treasure
trove
trove
of fresh
fresh
fruits she had grown
vegetables,
used to, and dairy products. Maria stared for a moment, her breath catching at the sight. Eggs, ripe tomatoes, crisp greens, blocks of cheese, it all looked like something out of a dream. It had been so long since she'd seen food like this, let alone had the freedom to choose what to prepare. She selected a few ingredients with care, her movements hesitant, as though she feared the spell would break if she moved too quickly. Eggs, a couple of vegetables, and a loaf of homemade bread found their way into her hands. Placing them gently on the counter, Maria paused, taking a deep breath. The simple act of holding these items filled her with a quiet, unfamiliar joy. With deliberate motions, she cracked the eggs into a bowl and whisked them together, her hands steadying as she worked. She diced the vegetables, savoring the tactile rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. Cooking had once been a routine, mundane part of her life, but tonight, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like control, like security, like hope. The skillet hissed as she poured the eggs in, the scent of cooking filling the air and wrapping around her like a warm embrace. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, letting the aroma wash over her. A smile crept across her face, small, tentative, but real. It had been so long since she'd smiled like this, so long since the act of preparing a meal carried more than just survival. She cut the bread into thick slices and imagined Emma's reaction when she woke to find a meal waiting for her. The thought warmed Maria's heart and her smile grew. This was more than food, it was a piece of normalcy, a token of love she could give her daughter even in the midst of their uncertainty. As the eggs finished cooking, Maria plated the simple meal and set it carefully on the table. She glanced back at the sofa where Emma still slept, her tiny form bathed in the soft glow of the kitchen lights. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maria felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten: peace. She sat down at the table and took a bite, savoring the taste as if it were a feast. The food was simple, but to Maria, it was a banquet, a celebration of survival, of finding safety if only for one night. And in that quiet moment, as the storm raged outside, Maria let herself believe that brighter days might still be possible. The simple meal was finally ready, the smell of warm eggs and toasted bread filling the air like a comforting hug. Maria sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting gently on the plate before her. Her heart felt warm, her eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and gratitude. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the gnawing grip of uncertainty. This moment, however fleeting, was hers. The soft scent of the food stirred Emma from her slumber. The little girl blinked awake, her wide, innocent eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings before landing on her mother. Maria lifted her gently, cradling her with a tenderness that transcended the exhaustion etched into her body. Emma's face lit up at the sight of the food, her tiny hands reaching out with excitement. Maria couldn't help but laugh, a quiet, heartfelt sound that she hadn't heard from herself in far too long. She carefully fed her daughter, savoring each delighted expression that crossed Emma's face as she took a bite. The child's giggles filled the room, her joy radiating a lightness that Maria desperately needed. For most people, this scene might have been mundane, a routine moment easily overlooked. But for Maria, it was a stolen piece of normalcy, a rare and precious gift from a life she once knew but had lost. As they ate together, Maria allowed herself to truly relax for the first time in months. Each bite nourished more than just her body, it strengthened her spirit, filling the hollow spaces within her. This modest meal became a banquet, a quiet celebration of survival and hope, even amidst the storm that continued to rage outside. After dinner, Maria sat back and watched as Emma played with a spoon, her tiny fingers gripping it like a prized possession. The child waved it around as though it were the most precious toy in the world, her face lit with innocent delight. Maria's gaze softened, a serene smile playing on her lips as she savored the moment. For once, the chaos of their world felt far away. But practicality soon nudged at her thoughts. Maria rose from the table, scooping Emma up into her arms. She wandered through the house, her bare feet silent on the smooth floors, searching for a place to give her daughter a warm bath. When she found the master bathroom, she stopped in her tracks, stunned. The space was enormous, its walls clad in sleek white marble that glowed under the soft, golden lighting. Heated floors warmed her toes, and a bathtub large enough for two gleamed invitingly in the corner. Everything about it radiated luxury, far beyond anything Maria had ever dreamed of. For a moment she stood frozen, unsure if she truly belonged here. But then she looked down at Emma, whose curious eyes gazed at the shimmering tiles and gleaming fixtures. Maria took a deep breath, grounding herself in the knowledge that this moment was theirs to claim. At least for tonight she could give her daughter something she had never had: warmth, comfort, and a feeling of home. With renewed determination, Maria stepped forward, ready to make the most of this unexpected refuge. The bathroom was like something out of a dream. White marble walls shimmered under the soft, golden light, and heated floors radiated a comforting warmth that reached Maria's tired feet. In the corner, a bathtub large enough for two glistened, its smooth edges inviting her to escape into its embrace. The grandeur of the space was overwhelming, but as she stood there, cradling the harsh reality she'd faced, Maria took a deep, felt like a world she had never belonged to. For tonight, a place reserved for lives far removed from her comfort, not for herself, but for her daughter. She walked to the tub and turned on the tap, watching as warm water began to fill the basin, soft steam curling into the air. The gentle sound of the water was soothing, a prelude to the peace she desperately hoped it would bring. Carefully, Maria undressed Emma, her hands moving with a tenderness that only a mother could provide. She lowered the little girl into the water, her heart swelling as Emma's eyes widened in surprise at the soothing warmth. A delighted giggle escaped her daughter's lips, and soon she was splashing playfully, her laughter echoing through the grand space. Maria couldn't help but smile, the sound of Emma's joy dissolving the tension that had gripped her for so long. It was as if the bathroom itself had transformed into a bubble of happiness, a temporary sanctuary where worry couldn't follow. She gently washed Emma's tiny fingers and delicate face, marveling at her daughter's innocence. Every giggle, every splash felt like a small victory, a reminder of why Maria had fought so hard to protect her. After wrapping Emma in a soft robe she'd found in the closet, Maria laid her on a plush towel near the tub. The little girl yawned, her eyelids fluttering as she drifted closer to sleep. Maria watched her for a moment, her heart filled with a quiet sense of gratitude. For this night at least, Emma was warm, safe, and happy. Finally, Maria allowed herself to step into the bath. The warm water enveloped her, washing over her skin like a gentle embrace. It carried away the grime of countless sleepless nights spent in the cold, but more than that, it began to strip away the weight of painful memories. Closing her eyes, she let herself drift, transported to a time when she still had a home, when her future had seemed bright and limitless. For a few precious minutes, the water became her escape, a place where she could lay down the burdens she carried, even if only for a little while. As the warmth seeped into her aching body, Maria felt something she hadn't in months, a glimmer of hope. The life she had once imagined for herself and Emma still felt impossibly far away, but tonight, in this unexpected haven, it didn't feel completely out of reach. She opened her eyes, exhaling deeply. Tomorrow would bring uncertainty, but for now Maria allowed herself to believe that this moment of peace was hers to hold. Life had taken Maria on a path she never would have chosen, its unpredictable turns dragging her farther and farther from the dreams she once held so close. She had learned, through harsh and unforgiving lessons, that destiny wasn't always kind. But as she stepped out of the bath, the warm water dripping from her skin, she felt lighter, as though she'd left a piece of her pain swirling down the drain. Wrapping herself in a soft, luxurious robe she'd found neatly folded nearby, Maria let out a deep sigh. The fabric hugged her like a tender embrace, almost unreal in its comfort. She glanced toward the bed, where Emma was already fast asleep. Her small body was nestled among the plush pillows of the king-sized bed, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, peaceful motion. The sight was rare and precious, one that brought a wave of relief crashing over Maria. Carefully, she climbed into the bed and lay beside her daughter. She adjusted the blanket around Emma's little frame, her arms instinctively pulling her child close. Emma's warmth seeped into her, and Maria felt her heart swell with a mixture of gratitude and hope. For the first time in months, Maria allowed herself to simply be. The accumulated exhaustion of countless sleepless nights, of fear and uncertainty, began to wash over her in heavy waves. She sank deeper into the soft mattress, the clean scent of the sheets enveloping her like a shield against the storm still raging outside. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, her mind drifting. She thought of all they had endured, the sacrifices, the moments of despair, and the glimmers of hope that had kept her moving forward. This night was a gift, an impossible moment of respite she never could have imagined. She didn't know what the next day would bring, and a part of her didn't want to. Right now, for this fleeting moment, she had what mattered most: warmth, safety, and her daughter in her arms. Maria tightened her hold on Emma and let her thoughts quiet. The storm outside continued to howl, but its fury felt distant, unable to touch her here. For the first time in what felt like forever, her fears and anxieties loosened their grip on her heart. And then, almost without realizing it, Maria drifted off to sleep. It was a strange peace that enveloped her, one she hadn't known in years but welcomed like an old friend. As she surrendered to the comfort of the moment, her breathing steadied, and her exhaustion finally gave way to rest. In the stillness of the room, with her daughter snuggled in her arms, Maria dared to hope, not for a perfect future, but for the strength to face whatever came next. Tonight, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, life could offer her more than it had taken. As Maria sank deeper into the soft embrace of the bed, the weight of her past seemed to lift, if only for a little while. The shadows of all she had endured, the pain, the fear, the endless nights of uncertainty, faded into the background. With a deep, steadying breath, she let herself drift into a sleep that was more restorative than any she had known in years. That night, her dreams carried her back to a time when her life had been filled with hope and possibility. She saw herself as a younger woman, her heart brimming with ambition and a determination to make a difference in the world. She remembered long days spent studying, poring over books with the unshakable belief that her hard work would carve out a brighter future. Back then, nothing had seemed impossible. But those dreams had been stolen, interrupted by the cruel hand of fate. The vivid memories of loss and struggle flickered like a distant storm on the edges of her mind. Yet, as Maria slept, those thoughts didn't consume her. Instead, they gave way to a vision of what could be. A life where she and Emma were safe, where her daughter would never know the hardships that had marked Maria's journey. Maria shifted slightly in her sleep, her arm instinctively tightening around Emma. The comfort of the present wrapped around her like a warm cocoon, shielding her from the worries that usually haunted her. For the first time in a long time, her dreams weren't plagued by fear or regret. Instead, they were filled with hope, a fragile but beautiful image of a life where Emma could thrive, free from the burdens her mother had carried for so long. As the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the tall windows, Maria stirred. The room was still and quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic sound of Emma's breathing beside her. She opened her eyes slowly, her mind lingering in the space between sleep and wakefulness. The events of the previous day felt like a dream, but the sight of her daughter's serene face reminded her that this moment was real. Maria smiled, a small, tender expression that spoke volumes. The night had been more than just rest. It had been a lifeline, proof that there was still kindness in the world, still hope to be found even in the unlikeliest of places. She lay there for a few moments longer, soaking in the peace of the morning. Maria didn't know what challenges the day would bring, but for now she let herself savor the quiet joy of simply being here, with Emma safe and sound beside her. The sunlight grew stronger, bathing the room in a golden glow. Maria took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the new day seep into her soul. It wasn't just the comfort of the bed or the safety of the house that filled her with gratitude, it was the realization that she still had the strength to keep going, to keep building a better life for her daughter. In that moment she made a silent promise. No matter how hard the road ahead might be, she would hold on to the hope this night had given her and use it to carve out the future Emma deserved. As the first rays of sunlight spilled into the room, Maria stirred, drawing a deep breath that seemed to ground her in the reality of the moment. Slowly she opened her eyes, letting them adjust to the warm golden light filling the space. The soft bed beneath her, the cozy blanket that had wrapped her in its warmth, and Emma's serene, peaceful face beside her were tangible reminders of the haven they had found. Even if it was temporary, this moment was theirs, a fleeting reprieve from the chaos of their lives. Maria's gaze wandered across the elegant surroundings, the tall windows, the refined furniture, the subtle luxury that felt a world away from the life she had known. A faint smile touched her lips, but as she soaked in the serenity, a tide of memories surged forward, unbidden. Her past came rushing back like a turbulent river, overwhelming the fragile peace she tried to hold onto. She had never imagined life would bring her to this point. Years ago she had been a young woman brimming with hope and strength, her dreams stretching out before her like a clear and boundless horizon. Maria had worked tirelessly to achieve what had once seemed impossible, earning a spot at one of Chicago's most prestigious medical schools. She had defied the odds, overcome challenges, and pushed herself harder than anyone else to become the first in her family to pursue a college degree. Her professors had recognized her potential, praising her for her unrelenting dedication and passion for medicine. Maria had been the kind of student who didn't just study to pass exams, she studied to make a difference. Her compassion for others, her determination to ease suffering, had always set her apart. She could still remember the late nights at the library, her textbooks spread out before her, her dreams of one day helping others driving her through every sleepless hour. But now, that life felt like it belonged to someone else. Maria's chest tightened as the memories twisted into a painful reminder of all she had lost. The young woman who had been full of ambition and hope was now a mother fighting to keep her daughter safe, navigating a world that had proven harsh and unforgiving. Still, as her eyes fell back on Emma's sleeping face, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose rise within her. The warmth of the room, the sunlight filtering through the windows, and the quiet peace surrounding them reminded her that hope still lingered in her life. It hadn't been extinguished, it had just changed shape. Maria sat up, taking another deep breath, the determination in her heart growing stronger. Whatever it took, she would protect this fragile peace, not just for herself but for Emma. The challenges she had faced, the hardships she had endured, were part of her story, but they wouldn't define her future. This moment, however brief, was proof that brighter days were still possible. Rising from the bed, Maria looked out at the morning light and silently promised herself that she would do everything in her power to build a better life for her daughter. Even if the road ahead remained uncertain, she was ready to face it with a newfound resolve. Maria's passion for helping others had been a part of her for as long as she could remember. As a child, her mother used to say she had the heart of a healer, always caring for stray animals in the neighborhood, nursing birds with broken wings and comforting anyone who was hurting. That kindness had carried her through the years, shaping her dream of becoming a doctor. She wanted to ease suffering, to be a source of light in a world that could so often be harsh. Everything had seemed to be falling into place. Maria had earned her spot in a top medical program, her professors praising her tireless dedication and genuine compassion. Late nights were spent poring over textbooks, not just to earn good grades, it was late at night when the phone rang, the difference she could make. Tone cutting through the future felt bright, her Maria picked it up, but then knowing that her entire world was about to change. The voice on the other end delivered the devastating news. Her parents had been in an accident. They were gone. In an instant, the foundation of her life crumbled beneath her. The grief hit her like a tidal wave, consuming everything in its path. At first, the pain was silent and internal, a heavy weight pressing against her chest. But as the days turned into weeks, it began to seep into every part of her life. The vibrant, determined young woman she had been started to fade, her spirit drained by a sorrow that felt endless. With her parents' deaths, Maria lost more than just her family. She lost the emotional support that had always kept her grounded. Her mother's unwavering encouragement, her father's quiet wisdom, gone. And along with the love and stability, she lost the financial support that had allowed her to focus on her studies without worrying about mounting expenses. The bills began piling up, relentless and unforgiving. Determined to keep going, Maria took on a part-time job, balancing work and her demanding medical program. But the weight of it all became too much. Sleepless nights spent studying turned into sleepless nights spent working. The exhaustion was bone-deep, and her performance at school began to suffer. Maria was torn between her academic obligations and the harsh realities of survival. Every step forward felt like wading through quicksand, her once clear path growing murkier by the day. The dreams she had held so tightly started slipping from her grasp, leaving her with nothing but the daily struggle to make it through. Yet even in the depths of her despair, Maria clung to the flicker of hope that had always lived within her. The girl who had once believed she could make a difference wasn't completely gone. She was battered, yes, but still there, waiting for a moment to rise again. As Maria's energy waned under the weight of mounting hardships, she felt the world closing in around her. It was during this fragile, vulnerable time that Christopher entered her life. He seemed to appear just when she needed someone the most, a charming, understanding man who seemed to look right into her soul. Christopher was gentle, attentive, and engaging, a friend during her darkest days. He had a way of making her believe that things could get better, that she could still smile sincerely and find joy amidst the chaos. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maria allowed herself to lean on someone else, to believe in the possibility of love and support. She fell for him completely, trusting him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone before. Maria opened her heart, sharing the deepest parts of herself, her fears, her dreams, her vulnerabilities. She believed Christopher was her rock, her safe harbor in the storm. But as time went on, the man she thought she knew began to change. The once sweet and caring Christopher became possessive, his affection twisting into control. His words, once filled with encouragement, turned sharp and demanding. Maria, who had sought refuge in his love, now found herself ensnared in a web of manipulation and emotional abuse. The security she had once felt in his presence evaporated, replaced by an ever-present sense of dread. As Christopher's behavior escalated, Maria began to see just how deeply he had woven himself into her life. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, he began to take control. He manipulated her decisions, chipped away at her confidence, and isolated her from her sense of independence. And then the financial betrayals began. At first, Maria didn't notice. Christopher was subtle, careful. But over time, the emergency savings she had painstakingly built for herself began to dwindle. He siphoned money from her accounts, small amounts at first, until one day she realized that her safety net was gone. Completely gone. When she confronted him, Christopher revealed a side of himself that left her reeling. His response wasn't remorseful or apologetic, it was cold, calculated, and laced with cruelty. He laughed at her pain, dismissing her as naive and foolish for trusting him. The love and support she had once believed in had been nothing more than a facade, a tool he had used to gain control. That night, as Christopher walked out of her life without a trace of guilt, Maria was left shattered. She wasn't just penniless, she was carrying the weight of a child she hadn't even had the chance to plan for. She felt lost, abandoned, and utterly betrayed by the man she had once trusted with everything. What Maria didn't realize in that moment, though, was that she still possessed something far more powerful than Christopher's cruelty, her strength. Though she didn't yet see it, she would rise again, not because of anyone else, but because of the resilience that had always been within her. Christopher's betrayal had been insidious, creeping into Maria's life bit by bit until it was too late. At first, she barely noticed the small amounts missing from her savings, just a few dollars here, a small transaction there. But by the time the full extent of his theft became clear, her safety net was gone. All of it. The money she had worked so hard to set aside, the last bit of security she had in an otherwise uncertain world, had been drained away. One evening, Maria mustered the courage to confront him. Her heart pounded as she searched for the right words, hoping for some explanation, some shred of remorse. But Christopher's response was as cruel as it was indifferent. He didn't deny it. He didn't even attempt to justify his actions. Instead, he laughed, a cold, hollow sound that cut her deeper than any insult. "You actually believed I cared?" He sneered, his words laced with contempt. "All I ever wanted was your money. Watching you depend on me was the real payoff." Maria stood frozen, her mind reeling as his callous words pierced through her. The man she had trusted with her dreams, her fears, her heart, had never loved her at all. To him, she had been nothing more than a means to an end. And when he had taken all he could, he left without a backward glance, without even a flicker of guilt. That night, Maria sat alone in the small apartment they had shared, the weight of her world crashing down around her. She was penniless, abandoned, and carrying a child she hadn't even had the chance to plan for. The shock and betrayal were suffocating, but even in the depths of her despair, she knew she couldn't give up. She had to find a way forward, for herself and for the life growing inside her. Without financial or emotional support, Maria was forced to leave medical school. The dream she had worked so hard for slipped away, replaced by the harsh realities of survival. She searched tirelessly for work, hoping to rebuild her life one piece at a time. But every attempt was met with scorn, contempt, or rejection. Employers turned her away, unwilling to take a chance on a young, pregnant woman with no stability. The city that had once been a canvas for her aspirations, its towering skyline a symbol of possibility, had now become her battleground. Each day was a fight for survival, a relentless cycle of struggle and disappointment. New York, once a place of hope, now felt like a labyrinth of unyielding obstacles. As Maria sat in the quiet of another uncertain night, her hands cradled her growing belly. She thought about the child she would soon bring into the world, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her chest. Her tear-filled eyes landed on her daughter's tiny face in her mind's eye, a face she hadn't yet seen but already loved with every fiber of her being. Maria wiped her tears, steeling herself against the hopelessness that threatened to consume her. She didn't know how she would do it, but she knew one thing with certainty: she would fight for her child. No matter how many times the world knocked her down, she would get back up. For her daughter, she would find a way. Maria's eyes lingered on Emma's peaceful face, her tiny features illuminated softly by the golden light of the room. In that little face, Maria saw both the pain and the strength that had carried her through every trial. Her daughter was her anchor, her only treasure. For Emma's sake, Maria had endured freezing nights, relentless exhaustion, and the constant weight of insecurity. Every day was a battle, every night a gauntlet of threats and fear. Yet Maria bore it all in silence, her resolve unwavering. No matter how much the world pushed her to the brink, Maria refused to let despair take hold. When she looked at Emma, she forced herself to smile, hiding the tears that threatened to fall and the fears that gnawed at her soul. It was her unspoken promise. Emma would never carry the weight of her suffering. Maria would shield her from it no matter the cost. Now, standing in the warmth and safety of the mansion, Maria felt something unfamiliar, a deep, quiet gratitude that began to well up within her. The memory of everything she had endured only sharpened the contrast of where she was now. The cold nights, the hunger, the moments of hopelessness, they all underscored the magnitude of this gift. Ethan, a man who knew nothing of her story, had extended more than just kindness. He had given her something far greater, a chance to breathe, to rest, to reclaim a moment of peace before stepping back into the storm. Maria's thoughts turned to how she could ever thank him. Words felt inadequate, their weight too light to convey the enormity of her gratitude. It wasn't just the physical protection of the house or the warm bed he had offered. It was the reprieve, the space to let her guard down and exist without fear, even if just for a night. It was the knowledge that someone, a stranger, had seen her and chosen to help without expecting anything in return. Her heart swelled, but the words she sought wouldn't come. Instead, Maria closed her eyes, the soft hum of the room wrapping around her like a lullaby. She allowed herself to let go of the tension she had carried for so long, the muscles in her body finally relaxing as she sank into the present moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maria felt safe enough to rest. It was more than comfort, it was hope. And hope, she realized, was the rarest and most precious gift of all. Maria sat quietly, the warmth of the room enveloping her as her thoughts wandered. She searched for some way to repay Ethan, her mind drifting back to memories of her first night in college. She remembered the joyful days spent with her parents, their unwavering support and the love that had once filled her life. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, part of a world that had unraveled far too soon. But now, sitting here, Maria felt a spark she hadn't in years, a belief that life could still hold something good. Ethan's kindness had given her more than just a roof or a place to rest. He had offered her something no amount of money could buy, proof that compassion still existed in the world. She decided right then that she wouldn't let his generosity fade into memory. She would honor this act of kindness, not just with gratitude but by finding a way to rebuild her life. The challenges she had faced, The loss, the betrayals, the endless struggle, had tested her in ways she could barely articulate. But now, with Emma in her arms and a renewed sense of will in her heart, Maria resolved to turn her gratitude into action. She didn't know if Ethan would ever fully understand the depth of her thankfulness, but she promised herself that she would make this moment matter. He hadn't just given her a place to rest, he had given her peace. And that peace had reignited a strength she thought she had lost. It was the strength to keep fighting, to forge a better future for herself and her daughter. She would ensure that Ethan's gesture wasn't wasted. As Maria rested in the quiet, Ethan was on his way back to the mansion earlier than expected. His meeting had been postponed, and as his car pulled into the driveway, he felt an unusual sense of anticipation. The grand house, which had always been a symbol of his success, now felt different, less a fortress and more a place where something meaningful was unfolding. When Ethan stepped through the front door, the house was quiet, but it felt alive in a way he couldn't quite describe. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he was eager to see how Maria and her daughter were doing. He had given them shelter almost on impulse, but as the day wore on, he realized that the decision had stirred something within him, something he hadn't felt in years. Little did he know, the connection he had sparked in that moment of kindness would soon lead to a transformation neither of them could have foreseen. As Ethan stepped into his house, a strange feeling washed over him, a warmth he couldn't quite place. The mansion, usually quiet and almost sterile, felt alive in a way it never had before. He paused in the hallway, his ears catching a sound he hadn't heard in years, the soft, joyful laughter of a baby. Curiosity tugged at him and he followed the sound down the corridor. It led him to a slightly open door. Afternoon sunlight poured into the guest room, illuminating a scene that stopped him in his tracks. Inside, Maria knelt on the plush rug, her daughter Emma perched on the floor in front of her. Maria held a stuffed bear, making it dance playfully from side to side. Emma's laughter rang out with every movement, her tiny hands reaching for the toy as Maria pulled it just out of her grasp. The room was filled with a lightness, a sense of peace and joy that felt almost otherworldly. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, silently observing the scene before him. Maria's expression was radiant, her face glowing with genuine affection and joy as she played with Emma. It was a warmth Ethan hadn't realized he'd been missing in his life. For someone so burdened by hardship, Maria's smile was remarkable, a testament to her resilience and love for her child. Emma's giggles echoed through the room, her tiny hands clapping as Maria brought the bear closer. The simplicity of the moment, the pure happiness radiating from them both, captivated Ethan. He had grown accustomed to a life of control, structure, and ambition, but watching Maria and Emma, he felt something stir deep within him, something unfamiliar but undeniably real. Without realizing it, a gentle smile crept across Ethan's face. The mansion, with all its grandeur and luxury, had never felt like home. It had been a fortress, a place to work, to rest, but never to truly live. And yet, in that moment, Maria and Emma's presence seemed to transform the space. Their laughter filled the air, softening the sharp edges of his carefully constructed world. Ethan stood there for a few more seconds, caught in the warmth and simplicity of the moment. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a sense of longing, perhaps, or the quiet realization that something vital had been missing from his life. The coziness, the humanity, the genuine connection he witnessed now felt more valuable than anything his success had ever brought him. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't think about his next meeting, his next deal, or the next step in his carefully planned life. Instead, he stayed rooted in the moment, watching the small family in his guest room and wondering how their presence had managed to change everything so profoundly. Maria sensed the presence before she saw him, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made her turn around. Her cheeks flushed slightly with surprise and embarrassment as her eyes landed on Ethan, standing silently in the doorway. Quickly, she put the stuffed bear down and scooped up Emma, holding the giggling baby close to her chest. Emma, still unaware of Ethan's presence, continued to smile, her tiny hands playing with the folds of Maria's shirt. But Maria hesitated, a flicker of worry crossing her face, as though she feared being reproached for letting her guard down and enjoying a moment of lightness in his home. "No need to stop on my account," Ethan said gently, his voice unexpectedly soft and almost encouraging. Maria relaxed slightly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, though her expression remained cautious. Her eyes, however, betrayed a mix of surprise and gratitude that Ethan couldn't ignore. It was then that he realized just how much his simple offer of shelter meant to her. The sincerity in her gaze was undeniable, and it struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The safety and comfort his house had given her wasn't just about a roof over her head, it was about so much more. For Maria, it was a reprieve from hardship, a brief oasis in a desert of uncertainty. And in that moment, Ethan understood that what he had thought of as a passing act of kindness was, to her, a lifeline. I didn't know you'd be back so soon," Maria said quietly, her voice trembling slightly but carrying a quiet dignity. Ethan took a few steps into the room, his eyes moving to Emma, whose curious gaze now focused on him. The baby tilted her head slightly as though studying him, before reaching out one tiny hand toward him. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before extending a finger, unsure of what to expect. Emma's soft, warm hand wrapped around his finger, and Ethan felt a strange sensation ripple through him. Her innocent grasp was so simple, yet it carried a weight he hadn't anticipated, a sweetness and trust that touched him in a way he hadn't felt in years. He found himself smiling, a small, genuine expression that felt natural and unguarded. "She's amazing," Ethan murmured, his eyes still on Emma. Maria smiled back at Maria, her pride noticing how her daughter, evident tinged with exhaustion, was filled with a quiet strength and voice steady now, filled with warmth. He had offered her a safe place, but he was beginning to understand that what she had brought to his home was far more profound, a sense of humanity and warmth he hadn't even realized he was missing. In that small shared moment, the lines between their very different worlds blurred, and something deeper began to take root in the silence between them. Emma's tiny hand grasped Ethan's finger with surprising strength, her innocent curiosity radiating in the simplest of gestures. It was such a small thing, yet it carried a sweetness that touched him in a way he hadn't expected. He felt his lips curve into a genuine smile, one that wasn't calculated or guarded. The warmth of the moment washed over him, disarming and deeply unexpected. "She's amazing," Ethan murmured, his gaze still on Emma, who babbled happily in her mother's arms. Maria smiled softly, her pride unmistakable. "Yes, she is," she replied, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of deep emotion. Her eyes shone with a feeling that seemed to transcend words, and she cradled Emma closer. "And I don't know how to thank you," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Having a safe night, a roof over our heads after so long, it's like a dream." Ethan's smile faltered slightly as her words sank in. He could feel the weight of her gratitude, the depth of what this moment meant to her. It wasn't just a house or a temporary shelter, it was hope, a reprieve from the relentless struggle that had defined her life. The sincerity in her voice and the way her eyes glistened struck a chord he hadn't expected, filling him with a growing sense of responsibility that he couldn't brush aside. Maria and Emma weren't just strangers passing through his life. In their own quiet way, they had filled a void he hadn't even realized existed. The sound of Emma's laughter, the sight of Maria's soft smile, they brought a kind of energy to his house that felt new and almost transformative. For the first time in years, Ethan's home didn't feel like a cold, empty space. It felt alive. "Maria," Ethan said finally, his voice lower but filled with sincerity, "there's no need to thank me. Actually," he paused, hesitating before continuing, "I think I needed this as much as you do." Maria's eyes widened in surprise, her expression shifting to something unreadable, perhaps disbelief, perhaps wonder. She looked at Ethan, her gaze searching his face for the meaning behind his words. "I mean it," Ethan added, his tone soft but earnest. "You've reminded me of something I didn't even know I'd lost." The unexpected confession left Maria momentarily speechless. Her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she simply held Ethan's gaze, the silence between them heavy with understanding. In that moment, an unspoken connection formed, a shared recognition that, in different ways, both of their lives had been missing something vital. And in the quiet simplicity of their interaction, they each found a glimmer of something they hadn't realized they were searching for. It was almost unimaginable to Maria that a man like Ethan, so powerful, so self-assured, would admit to needing something, let alone her and her daughter. Yet here he stood, his words laying bare a side of him she hadn't expected. In that moment he didn't seem like the polished, invulnerable figure she'd imagined. Instead, he felt human, even vulnerable, as though his admission was a quiet surrender to emotions he could no longer deny. Suddenly, Maria saw something in Ethan she hadn't noticed before, a silent loneliness that mirrored her own. The realization sent a ripple of understanding through her, a connection she hadn't anticipated. Even so, she couldn't ignore the weight of her own gratitude. "I'm grateful," Maria murmured softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "This place, this chance, it means more than I can ever express. After so many hardships, it's more than I could have ever asked for." She held Emma close, her arms wrapping tightly around the small, warm bundle. Relief coursed through her, seeping into every part of her being. Ethan's offer to let them stay as long as they needed wasn't just a kind gesture, it was a lifeline. The knowledge that her daughter had a safe, warm place to sleep, free from the cold and the dangers of the streets, was a gift beyond anything Maria had ever imagined receiving. The weight of so many lonely nights, so many relentless hardships began to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maria allowed herself to feel a glimmer of renewal. Simply being under this roof, surrounded by warmth and safety, was enough to steady her weary heart and rekindle a strength she thought she had lost. Ethan watched her quietly, his chest tightening as he absorbed her words. The depth of Maria's relief stirred something within him, something he hadn't felt in years. There was a delicacy to her, a quiet strength that shone through even in her most vulnerable moments. And in that strength, he saw the echo of her struggles, the weight of what she had endured to protect her child. For Ethan, it wasn't just compassion he felt. It was something deeper, something that made him question his own life and the choices he'd made. Maria and Emma had brought a sense of humanity into his world, a warmth that had been missing for far too long. And as he stood there watching them, he realized that perhaps it wasn't just Maria and Emma who needed him. He needed them just as much. Ethan's gaze lingered on Maria as she cradled Emma, her arms wrapped protectively around the little girl. There was a quiet pride in the way she held her daughter, a determination that seemed to shine even through the weariness etched into her face. Ethan marveled at how someone who had endured so much pain could still radiate such profound kindness. Before he left, Ethan bent down, drawn by an inexplicable urge. He reached out and gently touched Emma's soft cheek. The baby turned her curious eyes to him, her tiny lips breaking into a delighted laugh. Without hesitation, she grabbed hold of his finger, treating it like her favorite toy. Ethan froze, a warm and unexpected tenderness washing over him. In that small, seemingly insignificant moment, something shifted within him. The touch, the laughter, the innocence, it ignited a spark in Ethan's heart that he couldn't quite explain. But it felt right, complete. As if this fleeting connection had uncovered a part of him he hadn't realized was missing. Maria watched quietly as Ethan straightened and turned to leave. She felt a wave of peace wash over her, a rare and welcome reprieve from the storm she had weathered for so long. His generosity, she realized, wasn't just about giving them shelter. It was something far deeper, a kind of silent acceptance, a lifeline that reached into the very core of her struggles. She didn't know if Ethan felt it too, this invisible thread that seemed to connect them. But she knew one thing with certainty: this moment would stay with her forever. It wasn't just a night of safety or warmth, it was a reminder that kindness, however rare, could still change everything. As Maria sat with Emma in the quiet of the mansion, another presence approached the grand estate. Victoria Sinclair arrived unannounced, her confident steps echoing across the marble entrance as her driver sped away. Her gaze was sharp, her demeanor commanding. She was a woman who expected the world to fall in line, especially when it came to Ethan. Victoria took in the imposing facade of the mansion, expecting to find Ethan waiting for her as usual. But what she would discover inside was a scene, and a connection she hadn't anticipated, one that would shake the carefully constructed balance of her relationship with him. Victoria Sinclair arrived at the mansion with her usual air of confidence, her heels clicking sharply against the stone driveway as her driver sped away. The heir to an empire that rivaled Ethan's own, Victoria had always carried herself with an unshakable sense of importance in his life. Their relationship had been tumultuous, marked by competitive tension and intense passion. She thrived on the belief that no one could rival her place at his side. Victoria didn't bother to announce herself as she swept through the grand entrance. She assumed, as always, that Ethan would be pleased to see her, and any unannounced visit would be welcomed without question. Her eyes scanned the familiar opulence of the mansion, the polished floors, the carefully curated art, the soft glow of light cascading through expansive windows. This was a world she knew well, one she believed she belonged in. She moved purposefully through the main living room, her sharp gaze noting every detail of the house she had frequented countless times. It wasn't long before she found Ethan in his study, seated at his desk with a stack of documents in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of restrained surprise and something else she couldn't quite place. Discomfort, perhaps? Over the past few months, Victoria had sensed a growing distance between them. And now, as she stood in the doorway, she could see it clearly in his eyes. "Ethan," she said with a confident smile, her voice warm but edged with control. "I missed you, so I decided to drop by unannounced." Ethan returned her smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Victoria," he greeted, his tone polite but lacking the enthusiasm she was used to. As they exchanged pleasantries, his gaze drifted, not to her but toward the hallway. It was subtle, but Victoria noticed immediately. Her brow furrowed slightly as she studied him. She knew Ethan well, his dedication to business, his practicality, and his meticulous control over his personal life. He was a man who rarely allowed distractions to interfere with his focus. But now something had changed. He seemed distracted, as though his mind was elsewhere, and his glance toward the hallway only deepened her suspicion. Victoria's sharp instincts kicked in. Whatever, or whoever, was occupying Ethan's thoughts wasn't her. And that realization sent a ripple of unease through her carefully composed exterior. She wasn't used to being anything less than the center of his attention, and she wasn't about to let that change without understanding why. "I see you've been busy," Victoria said lightly, taking a step closer. Her tone was casual, but her eyes probed for answers, searching his expression for clues to the shift she couldn't ignore. Ethan nodded, offering a non-committal response, but his subtle discomfort didn't escape her notice. Something, or someone, was different, and Victoria was determined to find out exactly what had changed in the house she once believed she could command as easily as Ethan's affections. Ethan had always been meticulous about keeping his private life under tight control, managing his relationships with the same precision he applied to his business dealings. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor, something Victoria couldn't quite place. As they talked, she caught a flicker of emotion in his expression that felt unfamiliar, undefined. It unsettled her. Her sharp instincts told her there was more to the situation than Ethan was letting on. And then, faintly, she heard it, a soft, childlike sound drifting down from upstairs. A laugh. Victoria frowned, her finely arched brows knitting together in confusion. The sound was out of place, foreign in a house like Ethan's, where everything was controlled and calculated. "What was that?" she asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. Ethan hesitated, his posture stiffening for a brief moment before he recovered. "Nothing," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. But Victoria wasn't one to let things slide. Without waiting for an explanation, she interrupted the conversation and strode purposefully toward the sound. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with a confidence that bordered on entitlement. Ethan considered stopping her but decided against it. Part of him knew she would eventually discover Maria and Emma, and he no longer felt the need to hide their presence. Turning the corner, Victoria froze. The scene before her was one she hadn't expected. Maria stood in the soft light of the hallway, holding Emma in her arms. The baby looked at the newcomer with wide, curious eyes, her tiny hand gripping Maria's shoulder. Shock flashed across Victoria's face, quickly followed by a wave of distrust and thinly veiled resentment. Her sharp eyes scanned Maria from head to toe, taking in every detail, the simplicity of her clothes, the way she cradled Emma protectively, the tired but kind expression in her eyes. To Victoria, everything about Maria screamed out of place. "And who," Victoria began, her voice dripping with venomous mockery, "might you be?" Maria stiffened at the tone, immediately sensing the hostility behind the question. Her grip on Emma tightened, her instincts screaming to shield her daughter from the coldness emanating from the other woman. Victoria's gaze lingered on Emma for a moment before snapping back to Maria, her expression hardening. She didn't need to hear the answer to her question. She had already decided how she felt about the stranger standing before her. To Victoria, this woman was an intruder, someone who didn't belong in Ethan's world. And the presence of a child only deepened her resentment. Maria swallowed hard but kept her composure, her voice calm despite the unease coursing through her. "I'm Maria," she said simply, her tone steady but guarded. "And this is my daughter, Emma?" Victoria's lips curled into a tight, insincere smile, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed Maria once more. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent battle of wills unfolding between the two women. And though Maria stood her ground, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a confrontation far more complicated than she had anticipated. Maria hesitated, her body stiffening under the weight of the other woman's piercing gaze. But she forced herself to stay calm, keeping her voice steady and polite despite the growing discomfort that Victoria's presence stirred in her. "I'm Maria," she said simply, her tone measured. "And this is my daughter, Emma?" Victoria's lips twisted into a tight, sarcastic smile as she stifled a laugh. Her eyes swept over Maria once more, brimming with disdain and judgment. Every detail seemed to fuel her contempt, the simplicity of Maria's clothes, the softness in her voice, the protective way she held Emma. To Victoria, this woman didn't just not belong here. She was an interloper, a stranger who had somehow managed to slip into a world where Victoria saw herself as queen. The thought that Ethan could care for someone like Maria was unthinkable to her. The jealousy bloomed in her chest, sharp and hot, as if Maria's very presence was a challenge to the control Victoria believed she had over Ethan's life. After a tense pause, Victoria gave Maria one last scrutinizing look before turning abruptly on her heel and walking away. Her heels clicked with purpose as she made her way back to the study, where Ethan was waiting. When she entered the room, her expression was no longer the composed, confident facade she had worn upon arrival. It was etched with distrust and simmering jealousy. She wasted no time addressing the matter, her words dripping with irony and accusation. "So, the young lady I found upstairs," Victoria began, arching a brow. "Is she your latest guest?" The way she spat the word guest left no doubt as to her insinuations. Ethan remained calm, though her tone and expression didn't escape him. He could feel the discomfort settling in his chest, knowing how difficult it would be to explain Maria's presence to Victoria. But he also knew that hiding the truth, or appeasing Victoria's ego, was no longer an option. "Maria and her daughter are going through a tough time," Ethan said evenly, his voice deliberately steady. "I offered to help them." Victoria's eyes narrowed, her disbelief and irritation evident. To her, Ethan's explanation was insufficient, a flimsy excuse for something far more personal. The assessing look she gave him made it clear she assumed the worst, her mind already twisting the situation into something that aligned with her insecurities. Ethan met her gaze without flinching, but a subtle tension crept into the room, an unspoken battle of wills. Victoria's jealousy was palpable, and her frustration at being unable to control this part of Ethan's life only deepened the rift between them. Ethan kept his tone neutral, his voice steady as he replied, "I offered to help." But Victoria's reaction was immediate and sharp. Her eyes narrowed, jealousy flaring visibly in her expression. The idea that Ethan, always reserved, careful and calculating, had opened his home to a stranger was something she couldn't reconcile. The thought that he had shown such generosity to someone else, someone she deemed unworthy, gnawed at her, fueling her resentment. Victoria's thoughts churned, her anger and jealousy growing with every second. She couldn't accept this situation, couldn't stand the idea of Maria and her daughter remaining determined to assert her influence. She decided to do everything in her power to push Maria out of the picture. "Don't you think it's risky, Ethan?" Victoria asked, her voice laced with insinuation. "Letting someone you barely know stay here? She could be taking advantage of your kindness." Her tone was loaded with suggestion, each word carefully chosen to plant doubt. Ethan remained silent, but he couldn't entirely ignore the unease creeping into his thoughts. He trusted Maria. Something about her sincerity and the way she cared for Emma felt deeply genuine, but Victoria's sharp words cut through his confidence. Victoria noticed his hesitation and pressed harder, sensing an opening. "Think about it, Ethan," she continued, her voice softer but more pointed. "She's a stranger showing up out of nowhere with a child no less. It's an easy situation to manipulate, isn't it? How do you even know she's trustworthy?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he absorbed her words. He hated the way Victoria could twist a situation, turning compassion into suspicion with a few calculated phrases. Yet, despite his frustration, he couldn't entirely dismiss her point. Security and appearances had always been vital to him, and Victoria knew exactly how to use that against him. Victoria leaned in slightly, her tone almost pitying now, as though she were doing him a favor. "You're not the kind of man to let emotions cloud your judgment, Ethan. You've always been careful. This feels impulsive. You don't even know what her intentions are." The weight of her words hung heavily in the room. Ethan's mind wrestled with the conflict between what he knew to be true about Maria and the doubts Victoria had skillfully sown. Part of him resisted, refusing to believe that Maria could be anything but honest. But another part couldn't ignore the implications Victoria had raised, however unkind they might be. Victoria watched him closely, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes as she saw her words take root. She had no intention of letting this matter rest. In her mind, Maria and Emma were obstacles to her control over Ethan, and she was determined to remove them, one way or another. Ethan paced the length of the hallway, Victoria's words lingering in his mind like unwelcome shadows. Part of him resisted the idea of doubting Maria. Everything about her had felt genuine, from the way she cradled Emma to the quiet strength in her voice. Yet, another part of him couldn't entirely dismiss the implications Victoria had raised. Her sharp, insinuating words gnawed at the edges of his confidence, leaving him unsettled. With a sigh, Ethan decided he needed clarity. He made his way to the guest room, his footsteps heavier than usual. When he stepped inside, Maria looked up, and the tension in his expression sent a chill down her spine. Something in his demeanor had shifted, and it wasn't hard for her to see. Her heart began to race as the unspoken possibility of mistrust hung in the air. "Maria," Ethan began, his tone firm but hesitant, as though the words were difficult to say. "I need to understand a bit more about your story. Is there something you need to tell me?" Maria froze, the question striking her like a blow. The weight of his serious gaze and the shift in his tone felt like judgment, a silent accusation she hadn't expected. She opened her mouth to respond but faltered, caught off guard by the sudden shift in their dynamic. Taking a deep breath, she tried to gather her thoughts, but the memory of Victoria's disdainful expression and cutting words flashed through her mind, leaving her feeling humiliated. Maria straightened her shoulders, her voice trembling but steady enough to convey her sincerity. "I've already told you what's important," she said softly, her heart heavy. "I never wanted to take advantage of you or your kindness." Ethan watched her closely, taking in every detail of her reaction. There was no anger in her voice, no defensiveness, only a quiet sadness and a hint of fear. Yet, the seeds of doubt planted by Victoria remained, their roots clinging stubbornly to his thoughts. He didn't want to believe Maria could be dishonest, but the conflicting emotions swirling within him made it difficult to see clearly. Maria's gaze dropped to the floor, the vulnerability in her posture stark against the strength she had shown earlier. The sudden shift in their relationship, the implication that she might be anything less than honest, weighed on her deeply. She had come to see this house as a brief sanctuary, a place where she and Emma could finally feel safe. But now, the fragile trust she had felt was slipping through her fingers. Ethan studied Maria, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He didn't want to believe she could be dishonest, but Victoria's words had planted seeds of doubt he couldn't entirely shake. Maria, in turn, saw the turmoil etched into his face, and for the first time, a crushing realization settled over her. This sanctuary, which had come to mean so much to her and Emma, was perhaps nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The sharp pain of his doubt struck her pride, cutting deeper than she expected. Maria's chest tightened as she held Emma closer, her arms wrapping protectively around her daughter. She knew she couldn't prove her honesty, and the thought of staying where she wasn't truly accepted filled her with humiliation and desolation. Gathering her resolve, Maria straightened her back, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "I think I understand," she said, forcing herself to meet Ethan's gaze. "Thank you for the help, Ethan, but Emma and I have stayed long enough." Without waiting for his response, she turned and walked out of the room, her steps firm but her heart heavy. Emma nestled quietly in her arms, blissfully unaware of the heartbreak her mother was carrying. Maria didn't look back, not wanting Ethan to see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. In the days that followed, the mansion, which had always been Ethan's fortress of tranquility, felt suffocatingly empty. The stillness was unsettling, the silence almost oppressive. Every corridor, every room seemed to echo with reminders of what he had lost. The sound of Lucy's joyful laughter, the gentle warmth of Maria's presence. It was all gone, leaving a void he hadn't anticipated. Ethan wandered through the house, his footsteps hollow against the cold floors. The vibrant energy Maria and Emma had brought into his home had vanished, replaced by an unnerving quiet. The house, once a symbol of his success and control, now felt like a prison of his own making. The solitude he had once embraced now wrapped around him like a suffocating cloak. Every corner reminded him of them, Maria's quiet strength, Emma's innocent joy. He could hear their echoes in the emptiness, see their shadows in the light that streamed through the windows. The absence was sharp and undeniable, stirring a restlessness within him that he couldn't ignore. Ethan realized too late that in doubting Maria, he had lost something far more valuable than he had ever understood. Ethan sat in his study, his eyes fixed on the stack of documents before him, but his mind was elsewhere. The once familiar solitude of the mansion now felt foreign and oppressive. Every corner of the house reminded him of Maria and Emma, their laughter, their warmth, the simple joy they had brought into a space that had always been cold and impersonal. He couldn't stop the memories from surfacing. He thought of Emma's contagious laughter, the way her innocent joy had filled the air and made the house feel alive for the first time in years. He pictured Maria's serene expression as she cradled her daughter, her strength shining even amidst her hardships. The image of Emma's tiny hand wrapping around his finger came back to him, along with the unexpected tenderness it had stirred within him. These moments replayed in his mind, each one leaving a deeper mark. Maria's presence had brought something to his home he hadn't realized he was missing. A humanity, a warmth he hadn't even known he needed. Now with them gone, the house felt emptier than ever before. The more Ethan dwelled on these memories, the more the weight of his doubts and regrets pressed on him. He thought of Maria's face when he had questioned her, the way her expression shifted to one of quiet hurt and resignation. Her silence as she left had been haunting, a sharp reminder of his own failure to trust her. Ethan's chest tightened as he replayed the moment she walked out of the mansion, her dignity intact but her pain evident. He hadn't even asked for an explanation, letting his own uncertainty, and Victoria's insinuations, cloud his judgment. The realization of how deeply he had wronged her began to settle in, heavy and unavoidable. What hurt the most was knowing that Maria hadn't argued or defended herself. Her resignation wasn't an admission of guilt, it was her acknowledgement that she didn't need to prove herself to someone who couldn't see her worth. And now, Ethan was left with nothing but the emptiness of his house and the memories of what he had let slip away. Ethan couldn't escape the image of Maria's face as she left the mansion. The quiet pain reflected in her eyes had seared itself into his memory, a bitter reminder of the damage his doubt had caused. She hadn't argued or tried to justify herself, her silence spoke volumes. She had accepted that her honesty would never be enough for him, and that realization struck him harder than he cared to admit. The more he thought about it, the more every word of accusation he had spoken felt cruel, unwarranted. Maria hadn't deserved his distrust, and the guilt of having given in to Victoria's manipulations now weighed heavily on him. Days passed in restless torment, his mind replaying every moment he had shared with Maria and Emma. Finally, Ethan made an inevitable decision. He needed the truth, not the poisoned assumptions Victoria had planted, but the real story. He hired a private investigator to uncover Maria's past. If he had allowed Victoria to cloud his view of Maria, he now needed to undo that mistake. He had to know who Maria truly was, beyond the layers of hardship and resilience he had glimpsed. The days of waiting for answers stretched endlessly. Ethan tried to focus on his work, burying himself in his responsibilities, but it was no use. Memories of Maria and Emma flooded his thoughts, breaking through his carefully constructed defenses. He recalled the warmth Maria had brought to his home, her soft smile and the way she had thanked him, her gratitude genuine and unguarded. He remembered the sound of Emma's laughter echoing through the halls, filling the space with a lightness that had been missing for so long. Ethan had never thought of his home as cold before, but now, in their absence, it felt lifeless. The house had been transformed by their presence, warmed by Emma's laughter, softened by Maria's quiet strength, and brightened by the bond they shared. For the first time in years, he had felt something other than solitude in the sprawling mansion. As the days dragged on, Ethan couldn't shake the ache of regret. He had allowed doubt to ruin something that had the potential to be meaningful. He wasn't sure what the investigator would uncover, but he knew one thing. He needed to make amends not just for Maria's sake but for his own. The connection he had felt to her and Emma wasn't something he could let go of so easily. And so, Ethan waited, haunted by memories, but determined to find the truth and, if possible, a way to make things right. The sense of loss gnawed at Ethan, growing heavier with each passing day. The more he thought about it, the harder it became to understand how he had ever doubted Maria's integrity. The warmth she had brought into his home, the quiet dignity she carried despite her struggles, how could he have questioned that? When the investigator's report finally arrived, Ethan opened it with shaking hands. Anguish and the need for redemption churned inside him as he began to read. Line by line, Maria's story unfolded with a depth that left him reeling. She had once been a dedicated student, brimming with promise and potential, her future bright until tragedy struck. The sudden loss of her parents had shattered her world, leaving her to navigate a path marked by pain, abandonment, and heartbreak. Her life had taken further cruel turns. A relationship she had trusted became abusive, and she was left to fend for herself, pregnant and alone. What followed was a solitary struggle to protect her daughter, a relentless battle against poverty and despair. Every detail in the report painted a picture of a woman who, against all odds, had endured with her dignity intact, her love for her child fueling her resilience. Ethan felt devastated. Maria had never been a schemer, never someone looking to exploit him or anyone else. All she had sought was a momentary reprieve, a shelter to catch her breath before continuing her fight. And yet, he had let Victoria's cold, manipulative words poison his view of her. Regret hit Ethan like a physical blow. The weight of his actions, of his betrayal of Maria's trust, settled heavily on his chest. He realized how selfish and unfair he had been, allowing his pride and the opinions of others to cloud his judgment. The pride that had always guided his decisions now felt hollow, replaced by a bitterness that was hard to bear. As Ethan set the report down, he felt a wave of clarity wash over him. Maria hadn't just needed help, she had deserved compassion, trust, and respect, none of which he had given her when it mattered most. He had failed her, and the knowledge of that failure burned deeply. But Ethan knew regret alone wouldn't fix what had been broken. If he was ever going to make amends, he needed to act, to find Maria and Emma and prove that he had learned from his mistakes. The question now wasn't whether he could make it right, it was whether she would let him. In doubting Maria, Ethan realized he had lost something far more valuable than anything his wealth could replace. As he continued reading the report, a painful clarity began to settle over him. The truth wasn't just about Maria, it was about himself and the choices he had made. He thought of Victoria, the woman he had once believed could stand beside him. But now her coldness, her relentless need to manipulate and control, disgusted him. The love he had thought he felt for her seemed hollow, a fabrication built on appearances and convenience rather than something real. Victoria had never been and would never be the person he truly needed. Recognizing this, Ethan felt the weight of his own blindness, his failure to see what had been right in front of him. His thoughts turned to Maria. He felt an urgent, almost desperate need to find her and Emma, not just to offer an apology but something more. Ethan wanted Maria to understand how profoundly she had impacted him. Her quiet strength, her kindness, and the warmth she had brought into his home had transformed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. The sincerity and light she had shared with Emma had become indispensable to him, filling a void he hadn't even known existed. Determined, Ethan made a decision. He instructed the investigator to locate Maria and Emma, vowing not to let another day pass without trying to make things right. That night, as the house around him stood still, he found no rest. His heart raced with anxiety, the fear of losing his chance to make amends gnawing at him. In the silence of his study, Ethan replayed every moment he had shared with Maria. He remembered her soft smiles, the way she held Emma with such tender love. He thought of the gratitude in her eyes when she thanked him, and the joy that had briefly brightened the mansion with Emma's innocent laughter. Every small gesture, every fleeting moment, now carried an unbearable weight. Ethan knew that his hesitation, his failure to trust her, had been a mistake he couldn't undo. But he also knew he had to try, to show her that he had learned, that her kindness hadn't been wasted on him. More than anything, he hoped for the chance to let her know how much she and Emma had come to mean to him. With that resolve burning in his chest, Ethan prepared himself for whatever it would take to find Maria. He didn't know if she would forgive him, but he was determined to make her understand that, for him, their time together had been more than just a fleeting encounter. It had changed everything. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Emma's laughter or Maria's quiet words of gratitude. He remembered the way she had looked at him, with respect, sincerity, and a kind of gratitude that had felt entirely undeserved. Those memories had lodged themselves firmly in his mind, driving him forward with a singular purpose: to fight for her forgiveness. Finally, the investigator provided the answer Ethan had been waiting for: Maria's location. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by a wave of apprehension. He didn't know how she would react to seeing him again. Would she hear him out? Would she accept his apology? Or would she shut him out entirely, unwilling to risk more hurt? Despite his fears, Ethan knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. He had to make her understand how deeply he regretted his actions and how much she and Emma had come to mean to him. It wasn't just about correcting a mistake anymore, it was about reaching for something he hadn't even realized he needed: a new life, one that included them. As Ethan left for the address where Maria was staying, his heart was a tangle of anxiety and hope. Each mile brought him closer to the moment of truth. His thoughts swirled, replaying every decision, every word that had led him to this point. He knew the weight of his actions rested squarely on his shoulders, and he was prepared to face whatever outcome awaited him. When he arrived, the sight of the modest building filled him with both anticipation and dread. Ethan stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The gravity of the moment pressed down on him, and for a fleeting second,
This wasn't just about
he
an
considered
apology.
turning back.
It was about
But he
showing
quickly
Maria that her
dismissed the
kindness
thought.
had changed
He
him.
couldn't let
that her
fear stop
presence
him now,
had awakened
not
something
after
within him
everything
he
couldn't ignore. He was ready to accept whatever response she gave him, even if it meant rejection. But deep down, he hoped she would give him the chance to prove the sincerity of his regret, and his hope for a future that included her and Emma. With that thought anchoring him, Ethan walked to the door, his heart pounding. Whatever awaited him on the other side, He was determined to face it, knowing that this was his moment to try and make things right. Ethan stood outside the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew without a doubt that Maria and Emma had become the most important part of his life. He couldn't let them slip away, not without trying to make things right. Taking a deep breath, he knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. Within moments, the door opened and there stood Maria. Her expression shifted quickly from surprise to cautious wariness, her eyes scanning his face as though bracing for the worst. For a moment, Ethan felt small under her gaze, his confidence faltering. But he knew this moment mattered too much to let his doubts win. "Maria," he began softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please?" He paused, gathering the courage to continue. "I know I'm probably the last person you wanted to see. But please, give me a chance." Maria said nothing, her expression unreadable, but her silence didn't deter him. Ethan pressed on, his voice trembling with emotion. "I made a terrible mistake. I let my doubts, my insecurities cloud my judgment, and I was unfair to you." He took another deep breath, his eyes searching hers for any sign of understanding. "Since you and Emma left, I've realized how much you both mean to me. The house, my life, it all felt empty without you." Maria remained silent, but Ethan could see the internal struggle playing out in her eyes. Her caution was evident, but there was something else, something that encouraged him to keep going. Her silence wasn't rejection, it was a reflection of the weight of the moment. "Maria," he continued, his voice steadying, "you gave me a perspective I didn't have before. You showed me what truly matters. And I'm not just here to apologize." He paused, his words carefully chosen. "I'm here to ask you to come back. Come home with me. Not as a guest but as part of my life." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Ethan's chest tightened as he awaited her response, his vulnerability laid bare. He had never been this open, this exposed. But for Maria and Emma he was willing to risk everything. "I want to give you and Emma the home you deserve," Ethan said, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "A home where you can be happy and safe. I don't want you to stay as guests, I want you to be a part of my life, or of our lives." Maria's breath hitched and she took a moment to steady herself. Her hands trembled slightly, the weight of his words pressing against the guarded wall she had built around her heart. For so long she had searched for a refuge, a place where she and Emma could finally feel at peace. Ethan's proposal was undeniably tempting, but the scars of abandonment and betrayal still lingered. Her gaze shifted away from him, falling on Emma who was playing near the door. The little girl's laughter rang out softly, her innocent joy filling the room with a lightness Maria couldn't ignore. Memories of their journey flooded her mind, long cold nights spent on the streets, the relentless pain of uncertainty, and the quiet moments of hope that had kept her going. She had endured so much to reach this point, and now, standing before Ethan, she felt as though life was offering her a second chance. Ethan's words, sincere and filled with regret, touched her deeply. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the genuine desire to make things right. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness, he was offering her and Emma something she had never dared to dream of. A real home, a place where love and security could finally flourish. Maria looked back at Emma, her heart swelling as she considered what this could mean for her daughter. A family. Stability. A chance at a life free from the hardships they had endured for so long. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, focusing instead on the possibilities that lay before her. When her gaze finally returned to Ethan, she found herself meeting his eyes with a new sense of calm. She could see the honesty there, the vulnerability of a man who was willing to lay everything bare for her and her child. And in that moment, Maria felt something shift within her. Forgiving him wouldn't erase the pain of the past, but it could open the door to a future she hadn't believed was possible. A future filled with hope, love, and the safety her daughter deserved. Accepting Ethan's invitation wasn't just an emotional decision for Maria, it was a chance at a new life, a fresh start she had never dared to imagine. As she stood there, weighing his heartfelt words, a small voice broke through the silence. Emma,
Her words
sensing
struck
the
Ethan
charged
like a
emotion
bolt
in
of
the
lightning,
air,
toddled
his heart
over to
racing
Ethan.
at the purity of
Her
her hope.
wide, curious eyes
He knelt
fixed
down
on
to
him,
her level,
and with a
his
sweet,
eyes glistening as
spontaneous
he opened
gesture,
his arms
she
and
reached
pulled
out
her
her
into a
tiny
warm
arms.
embrace.
"Uncle
"Yes,
Ethan,"
my little
she
one,"
said
he
softly,
whispered,
her
his
voice
voice
filled
thick
with
innocent
emotion.
expectation.
"I'll come with you.
"Are you coming with us?"
Forever.
Watching her daughter's unguarded gesture, Maria felt something shift inside her. It was as if Emma's innocence and unshaken belief in the goodness of others were giving Maria permission to hope again, to trust, to open her heart to the possibility of starting over. A small, quiet smile crept across her face, one Ethan noticed the moment he looked up. Her gaze met his, full of tenderness and silent understanding. The weight of the past, the pain, the fear, the doubt, seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile but unmistakable sense of possibility. "I accept, Ethan," Maria said at last, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "But only on one condition, that what we build is real. Without fear. Without distrust." Ethan nodded, his own tears threatening to spill as he reached for her hand. "I promise, Maria," he said earnestly. "I swear we'll build this together. And nothing and no one will take it away from us." In that moment the tension melted away, replaced by a shared resolve. Together they were stepping into the unknown, but they were no longer alone. For the first time in years, Maria felt the weight of the world ease, replaced by the possibility of a life filled with love, safety, and hope. As Ethan embraced Maria, a profound certainty settled over him. He was stepping into a new chapter of his life. In that moment, he realized that the love and trust growing between them were far stronger than any doubt or fear that had once plagued him. This wasn't just a reconciliation, it was the beginning of something transformative. When they returned to the mansion together, the once cold, formal environment felt entirely different. Emma's laughter echoed through the halls, filling the space with a warmth that had long been missing. Maria's gaze, now bright and serene, reflected a sense of peace and happiness that Ethan had spent years unknowingly searching for. His home, once a fortress of solitude, was now alive with the presence of a family. Meanwhile, Victoria learned of their reconciliation. The bitter reality of her defeat hit her hard. She hadn't just lost Ethan to another woman but to a family he had chosen to build with sincerity and love. For Victoria, this wasn't simply about losing her influence over Ethan. It was a humbling realization that she would never hold the place in his heart she had once assumed was hers. Defeated and humiliated, she left, knowing that her chapter in Ethan's life was closed for good. Over time, Ethan and Maria worked to create a life together, one built on trust and respect. Recognizing Maria's drive and potential, Ethan offered her a position within his company, a chance to dedicate herself professionally and grow in a supportive environment. He was there at every step, ensuring that her dreams, once derailed by hardship, could take shape again. Together, they gradually built a life that was genuine, filled with meaning and mutual support. For Emma, Ethan became more than just a constant presence. He became the father figure she had never known. The joy of raising Emma brought Ethan a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. One sunny afternoon, while they were playing in the garden, Emma turned to him with her wide, innocent eyes and called him Dad for the first time. Ethan's heart swelled with emotion, and he realized it was the most meaningful title he had ever received. From that day on, their lives blossomed, each morning a new promise of love, hope, and shared happiness. Together, they formed the family they all needed, turning what had once been a chance encounter into a future filled with possibilities. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, became a home where laughter and love thrived. Ethan became more than just a steady presence in Emma's life. He became the father figure she had always needed. In caring for her, Ethan discovered a purpose he had been unknowingly searching for, a sense of belonging and love that transformed his world. One sunny afternoon as they played together in the garden, Emma looked up at him, her little face alight with joy, and said, "Dad." The word was simple, yet it carried a weight that made Ethan's heart swell. In that moment he realized it was the greatest title he had ever received. Each day became a step toward a new life, a life where love, happiness, and security were no longer fleeting dreams but tangible realities. Ethan, Maria, and Emma became the family they had each been searching for, a family built on trust, hope, and a shared commitment to one another. Together, they created a home where love and hope blossomed with every sunrise, where the wounds of the past faded into distant memories. Their days were filled with laughter, shared joys, and the quiet comfort of knowing they were no longer alone. For Ethan, the once empty mansion had transformed into a true home, a place where the walls resonated with the sounds of life and the promise of a brighter future. And so, surrounded by the warmth of a life full of purpose and love, Ethan, Maria, and Emma built a future together. Each morning was a new beginning, each moment a reminder of the strength it took to get there. The past no longer defined them. It had become a story of resilience and redemption, a foundation for the life they now shared. The story of Ethan, Maria, and Emma is not just one about redemption and love but also a profound lesson on the power of kindness and human connection. From a chance encounter, their journey takes readers through a range of emotions, from suffering and loss to hope and happiness. The story reminds us that sometimes a small act, such as opening our hearts to help a stranger, can change not only their life but also ours. Maria represents resilience and hope. Despite a life full of challenges, she never gives up her role as a mother, always striving to give her daughter a better future. The image of Maria cradling her child in the rain or searching for food in Ethan's luxurious kitchen makes us appreciate the value of simple things in life. A roof over our heads, a meal, or a moment of peace. Ethan, transitioning from a successful yet emotionally empty man, discovers the true meaning of life through Maria and Emma. The story reminds us that success is not measured by wealth or status but by genuine relationships and love. It illustrates the transformative power of compassion and how it can fill the void within even the most hardened hearts. In real life, many around us face struggles similar to Maria's. This story stirs a sense of social responsibility, urging us to open our hearts and care for those in need. Sometimes, helping others brings unexpected happiness and meaning to our own lives. Ultimately, the story is not only moving but also inspires us to live with more kindness, strength, and appreciation for the relationships we have. It is a truly beautiful tale, a journey of healing and a source of inspiration for life. Love sometimes shouldn't rely too much on reason, as it might lose its essence. Let the heart speak for itself, for only the heart can truly feel what emotions are, what happiness truly means, not the brain with its formulas and rational control. I hope you've had a wonderful emotional journey guided by your heart while listening to this story. Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe to the Soul Deep Stories channel to hear more. If you have any thoughts or feelings to share, please leave a comment so we can chat together. I love you all and wish you a wonderful day. Red Heart.